Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join host George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by visiting US Modernist massive, highly addictive archives at usmodernist.org. And now the host with no architectural experience, education, or even any version of AutoCAD on their laptops, George Smart and Frank King.
Oh, man. Yeah, support for our uneducated U.S. Modernist Radio show comes from Mod Homes Realty. That is the wonderful, intelligent, lovely Sarah Salk, the real estate agent who gets modern like you do. Sarah Salk doesn't want any more modernist teardowns. She's great for sellers who want their homes to endure, and great for buyers who need her expertise, experience, and passion. You can find her at www.modhomesrealty.com or 919-601-7339.
And I'm George Smart. I want to give a big shout out to one of our fans in Australia, Ben Shuri. He is a chef at one of Australia's top restaurants called Attica, which is based on the idea that you would use native Australian ingredients in your meals. You'd think someone had come up with this before, but he was the first, and he's doing really well. We want to thank you, Ben, for listening to the show. Today, we talk about scale. What makes a house too big? And is it really anyone's business besides the owner? It's a real treat to talk with Thomas Bena and Mollie Doyle, stars and creators of the new documentary, One Big House. Thomas Bena founded and is executive director of the Martha's Vineyard Film Festival, located in Martha's Vineyard, which for those of you who failed geography class is an island of small villages off the coast of Massachusetts. Famous for fishing, beautiful summers, Martha's Vineyard continues to attract primarily wealthy people who want to build a summer place. Like many coastal communities, the Hamptons in New York comes to mind. Some of these new homes are not the cottages which have dominated the island for centuries. Now 10,000 square foot and 20,000 square foot and even larger McMansions started appearing during the 1990s. A carpenter by trade, Thomas moved to the town of Chilmark on Martha's Vineyard in the late 90s as a house carpenter, and in 2004 started working on One Big Home, a documentary about the disruption of life on the island by giant houses. But the film is more than the story of a cause. Along the way, he found a girlfriend, Mollie Doyle, who is with us today. They married, moved, and had a beautiful daughter named Emma, all events that influenced or changed the progress and perspective on the film. Premiering last year, after at least a dozen years of work, One Big Home has been acclaimed worldwide and received a standing ovation at, let me see where that was, the Martha's Vineyard Film Festival. Welcome, Thomas and Mollie.
Welcome. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi there.
To our lives.
So let me start by asking you, what motivated you to make the film? Was it one house in particular, or was it a combination of things?
It was, firstly, thank you for having me and my wife on your show. I appreciate that. It was a combination of things that I actually tried to edit a sequence and get it in the film, and it just became too much about me. So I took it out. But the genesis was when I was a young man working in the business world, fresh out of college. I felt like I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So rather than just ignore that and act like I was pleased sitting behind a desk every day, I went traveling. And when I went traveling, I came upon place after place where people said, geez, you should have been here 20 years ago. Oh, you should have been here.
Yeah.
And so after, almost a decade kind of working odd jobs in America, going back overseas, I landed on Martha's Vineyard. I came to my hometown to thank my high school English teacher for helping me. He used to ask really open-ended questions and philosophical questions, which I kind of made fun of in high school. But as a young man on the road, his questions kind of came back to me. So in his classroom, he has a ram's horn on his desk. And I said, that's right, you're a farmer. I want to know about farming. And so he said, well, come to my house in the vineyard. I just bought an old house there, and we're tearing the floors out of the barn. And so when I got here, I literally felt like I wasn't in America. I felt like I was in some other, like I say in the film, magic land. There were no strip malls, no 7-Elevens, no McDonald's, no Walmarts, no stoplights. And
wow.
And so I said, "This is incredible!" And instantly, the first day, can I move into your house? Can I stay here? And so I got a job as a carpenter. So when I moved here, I wasn't a carpenter yet, and I literally got a job the first day and started learning the trade. And within a few years, started working on really large summer homes that were empty most of the year. I'm talking, 10, even sometimes 11 months, but heated year-round or cooled year-round. And I realized that I was going to ruin this, kind of paradise found and turn it into the places I had heard about on my road trip. And so that was the genesis right there.
Well, this movie, besides being a story about houses and size, is also a couple of other things. It's a great history of Martha's Vineyard. But what I was struck with the most, and why I wanted to have you both on the show, is that this is a movie about your relationship. So, Mollie, at what point in this obsession, project, did you fall in love with Thomas?
I don't know. Thomas, you'd been, working on this film for, a year?
Well,
2 years when I met you?
I think we actually, we met the year I launched it, because you came to the festival in 2004, right?
Maybe,
That's when I started the film. So it was kind of all at once. It was just happening at the same time.
Yeah. So I was there at the beginning, and he showed me one cut, which is the famed cut in our marriage, which Thomas can tell you about. But he showed me the first cut, and I didn't love it.
You actually said you look like an asshole.
Oh.
Yeah. Well.
Wow. A few notes on the script. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think the piece that we haven't talked about yet, that we can all talk about, is that, the other thing that's sort of concurrent with Thomas running around and talking to people about their houses in the film is that Thomas and I ended up having to build our house here. And so I think that really gave the film some weight, because we had to make the same choices that a lot of people who build houses here have to make, which is just, you get to decide how high your ceilings are, you get to decide the size of your bathtub. And those were all things that we had to discuss and evaluate, and that kind of defined the film in a whole other way, I feel.
But Mollie, you said we had to build a new house and we had to choose how high our ceilings were. One of my so-called friends who kind of unfriended me around this time told me that I was a sellout, because in his mind we didn't need to build a new house. There were enough houses here. Why weren't we buying an old one and fixing it up? So
right,
we didn't have
to. We did buy an old house.
No, but I'm saying we didn't have to build a new one. We chose to.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair.
One of the unique things about the film is that you are on both sides of this issue at various points.
Yeah.
That's right.
Among others, Thomas, you spoke with legendary CBS reporter Mike Wallace, who's a summer resident there for decades. He said, conspicuous consumption satisfies some people. They work hard. It's a free country. Then he questioned why this was such a big deal to you. So why was it such a big deal that you would take a concern that probably a lot of island residents have and make it your mission?
Well, I think it's a great question. I mean, when he asked it of me, I only realize now, and I wish I could have thanked him for this when he was alive, but he really helped make this film what I think could have been an awful film into a solid film, because he made me talk about myself. And I had never considered why it offended me, really, until he asked me. It offended me. But then when I dug deeper, it was like, well, the waste of resources, for one. You're talking to a guy who, my mother came here when she was 11 from the Azores, so turning the lights off in every room was a real thing, and clipping coupons on Sunday was a real thing, and, you don't waste anything. And so to be building a house that is, 10 times, more than that, 15 times. I mean, some of these houses are 10, 15, 20 times the house of a local person, and they're heated year-round, but they're empty. That was the thing that really fired me up. The funny thing is, a lot of people that worked alongside me to pass this law, that didn't bother them. For them, it was the sheer scale and the way it was an affront to the landscape, and I shared that too. But this whole thing about wasting fuel oil and wasting resources to build these big structures, that was, for me, the thing that really got me going. And to see how, when I had been in the Hamptons visiting one of our friends out there who was raised out there, he took me, and I actually just thanked him for this on Saturday. He said, when I was a kid, this was all potato farms. And we're talking 55 years ago. We're not talking 500 years ago. And so standing in the Hamptons amidst these enormous, they dwarf the houses on the vineyard even, but these gigantic estates that weren't there 5 decades ago, that was a powerful experience. So those two experiences of being on the road, hearing, you should have been here when, and then actually building them day after day, seeing the people come in and tear this wall down. We don't want this. We want this. No, tear that down. We want this. It's just that waste. So that's really what pushed me over the edge.
For our listeners who are not familiar with construction, let's put some numbers on this. So let's say that you've got a really big house, say it's 20,000 square feet. How much construction waste is that going to generate during the building part? And how much fuel is that going to burn up over the course of a winter when nobody's there?
Well, those are great questions. I'll answer it in general terms, and not to be evasive, but just because that's kind of what I have. There's not a lot of data because every house is different. Some houses that are 20,000 plus feet, they say, listen, we have net zero, we have geothermal, we have solar panels, but by its very definition, you can't build a 20,000 square foot greenhouse because of all the materials that you use to build this empty house. That's, by its very definition, not sustainable and not green thinking. But on one 25,000 square foot compound that my best friend at the time worked on, he said about every week they would have this 30-yard dumpster that was filled with waste debris. Never mind, they throw away the old houses usually right into the dump. Sometimes not even with plucking out the windows and the doors and stuff. So it is kind of a huge issue for landfill. And like I said, when I did send some researchers to get the stats on how much fuel oil was used in these things, it was kind of, I don't know, they came back one after the other with it's too big to wrap our arms around. It depends on how you want to talk about it. And when we tried to put it in the film in general terms, it didn't work. So I decided I wasn't going to do a stat-driven film. I was going to do more of a heart story-driven film.
And where does this stuff go? I mean, it's an island.
Well, it gets shipped off island. It used to be buried here on the island, but now it's shipped off island.
On the North Carolina coast, there's a little beach community called Topsail. And it was all single family, many of them on the ground before a hurricane came through in 56 and took those away. But when they rebuilt, still single family. The way the city kept the number of units to a minimum was they controlled the sewer connections. And their big fear was not McMansions. It was condo complexes, sky-rise condos. So are these homes not ideal, but wouldn't you rather have those than, say, 8 or 10-story condo complex in the same spot?
Right. That's a great question. I actually, I think I'd rather have neither. I think I'd rather have a year-round house for a working family.
Good answer.
But not to, like I said, not to be evasive, but when I'm traveling, I actually am finding myself, when I'm traveling with the film and speaking about it, I'm stopping audience members in the middle of their rants because it doesn't matter. I was in Southampton at the Southampton Arts Center on Thursday night, and then I was in on the Shinnecock Reservation in Southampton on Friday night. Very different audiences. A median income on the reservation is $36,000, and in Southampton it's $86,000, and they're 10 minutes apart, but the same conversation. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's not for me to decide what other people need in their community. The message of my film and why I'm traveling with it is a community should be able to determine its own destiny. If it wants to be East Hampton, and just today the New York Post has the largest house for sale right now in the Hamptons. It's 23,000 square feet. It's for sale for $35 million. It's a new record.
Wow.
Renner's house is 60,000 with his buildings. It's 100,000. So they have huge estates. So if they want to be like that, go for it. But in the town where I live, where I'm raising my family and building a family, I just think, this is what we want here. We want a more rural existence. We don't want to become the Hamptons. So my answer is I would want neither. I would rather see year-round housing that's occupied by people. And if they're going to be summer homes, I'd rather see them rent them to people in the winter who actually need housing.
in Topsail, it was the city council who determined how many sewer connections there were, and that's how they kept the number of units on the beach down for decades. And then a more pro-development city council got into office and things began to change. So I know you would prefer year-round housing for residents, but this is apparently not a priority of the powers that be?
I think it's complicated. I think what's happened is, going into this last town meeting, spoiler alert, when we decided to pass a law, the town was split 50-50. There was a survey that went out. How many of you want to do something about trophy homes? And only 50% of the people said we should do something. The other 50 said it's fine. And so we didn't know what was going to happen. I hired 3 camera people. It's like, it's either going to be a sad ending or a happy ending, but I'm done. 12 years. And so we got 2/3 vote, which passed it. So that tells me that 2/3 of the people in my community don't want these gigantic trophy homes. There are a lot of people, builders, real estate people, all kinds of tradespeople, who are fine with this and who think what I'm doing is an awful thing, but they're not in the majority. And that's really important to point out, because until this town vote came, you would think, because of the bluster of the people that, don't want to see any kind of thing passed, that they were the majority. But in fact, they were the minority, and I hope it's a parallel lesson for our country, that, we have a lot of bluster in our country right now blowing around, and I hope that as people we can come together on both sides of the aisle and actually work together for our own destiny in this country.
Well, and speaking of both sides of the aisle, there's a woman who appeared anonymously who was conflicted about her own large house.
Yeah.
Tell us about her.
Well, I went in thinking I was going to get the smoking gun. I was going to get the devil, the person who's building this trophy home and ruining our community. And I actually was moved to, almost to tears in the interview, because she was a real person with, a husband who was dying, who is now passed, and the husband wanted to build what she called a monument for the family. It was his way of saying, I've worked my whole life, I busted my butt, made a bunch of money, as Mike Wallace said, I made my money, and here's what I'm going to do with it. And so I felt for her. I mean, they have a small apartment in New York. They wanted a big, lavish summer home for their family to come, and as a monument from Dad to his family. I don't think still it fits in. I don't think that it's if we had 50 of those in our community, it would actually be a good thing, because what's happening on Martha's Vineyard and what's happening in Nantucket and the Cape and many, many places, all the ski areas in the country, is that the people who are working there are forced out. But the funny thing is, or the sad thing, however you want to look at it, is that the workers still need to be there to work. So in the Hamptons last week, I was heading out for my screening, and my friend said, well, we better leave now. We have to beat the trade parade. And I said, what do you mean?
Oh.
And even on the back roads, what should have been a 15-minute drive took us an hour and 15 minutes. And it's so normalized out there. It's the frog in hot water analogy. And that's what this issue, why it's so hard to wrap your hands around it, because it's just one house in the middle of the woods. Why do you care? But over time, that land is used up, the community is forced to leave, and you're left with what's in Nantucket right now, which is basically a thriving summer resort community that in the wintertime, I think a few years ago they had 7 middle-aged men kill themselves, and they have a huge heroin epidemic.
Oh, man.
And so it's like, this is the stuff that these areas don't publicize because they don't want to hurt the tourism and hurt their, the pretty pictures we have of them. But on Provincetown and Cape Cod, on Nantucket, both papers wrote about my film when I went there. And in the same issue was a horrific story of a heroin overdose and the horrific affordable housing problem. I see these 3 issues as being related somehow. I'm not sure how. I'm not a social scientist, but I think our communities are falling apart, and we have to do some work to save them.
But Thomas, I want to go back to the interview that we all started this sort of section of our conversation about.
Yeah, sorry, I can go in a million directions.
But it's an interesting thing, because when you went to interview that person,
yeah,
you went in thinking that you were going to talk to, the other side, shall we say.
I was in judgment, total judgment.
You were in total judgment, and you came out of there. And one of the things that came out of that conversation that I don't think is in the film is that I don't think that person had any idea that her house would sort of be such a sort of feature on the land. She didn't really have a sense that
oh, that's right.
of what 12,000 square feet would look like on a piece of land.
right.
overlooking the water.
Right.
And I think that the thing that piece was a very important interview, because that's sort of what turned you to go talk to the architects, because
that's
I feel
a
like...
really good point, Moll. That's right, because she said, when I asked her, how big is it, she said 8,000. Remember, she didn't even know it was 11,000.
No, she didn't know. Well, it's almost 12,000 square feet. But she didn't know that, and I think that the interesting thing is that there has to be the responsibility of the community, for sure. I agree with what you're saying, but I think that it's also, if you're going to an architect who is a quote-unquote expert, the architects have to be the sort of the leaders, in a way, in terms of designing stuff that is environmentally sensitive and is sensitive to the community's needs.
So you're bringing up a great point. Thanks for bringing it back to that, Mollie. What I want to make one comment on that, which is that one of the biggest houses in the film, the architect pulled me aside last summer after we saw the film, and he said, listen, he's a very well-respected Manhattan architect, summer's here, and he said, I was expecting to hate the film, but I was very moved by it and the thesis and your story. Can we have lunch? Can we have a meeting? So we sat down, we had a meeting the next day, and he said, the house in particular in your film, this client came to me, and they said, we want a beach house in Martha's Vineyard, and we want this, and we want that, and we need this, and X, and Y, and Z, and we want it to be this big, and this, and that, and he said, well, that's a 15,000 square foot house. You're telling me you want me to tell that client that's not a beach house? And I said, yes. And he said, well, and this is what Peter Breeze told me too, who's we debated throughout the film, I don't feel comfortable doing that for my clients. And that's where I push back and say, but you consult with them on what kind of light bulbs to put in, or light fixtures, and what kind of window trim. Why would you not consult with them on the actual size? So I kind of don't buy when residential architects say they can't do that. I do think they get they get paid a percentage often of how much the person spends, and I think that is driving architects to kind of look the other way. I really do.
Well, in the movie, you have several conversations with Peter, and I understand he's now one of your supporters.
He is, in an odd way, and I went back 3 weeks ago and shot a 4 years later interview with him, which is on the DVD. If you want to buy the DVD, onebighome.com, but it's on there. That's my pitch. And in that 4 years later interview, he is oddly on my side, but he hasn't fully retracted what he said. What he did say, which is interesting, is that he believes, after seeing the film, after seeing it play out and seeing the response in the country, that perhaps residential architecture should be a separate degree from commercial architecture. He said, you have to understand, when you go study architecture at school, you spend your time week after week designing really big buildings. You're designing airports, you're designing shopping malls and hospitals. And he said, and so to design a 2,000 square foot house, you don't practice that a whole lot. There's not a whole lot there. And he thinks we should have two different distinctions. So I'm really hoping to get this into architecture and planning schools in the next year or two.
Well, that will be great, because I know it is something that's not particularly present in the curriculum, although architecture students talk about this idea of sustainability a lot. Mm-hmm. It's not extended to the actual size of something necessarily.
Right.
No, and then I think that the other thing that you brought up is that, you were talking about sewer systems, which is indeed one way that the towns can, if you can control the water, you can control what's happening, right? But in places like Martha's Vineyard, some of the towns have very limited sewer systems, but mostly we're dealing with wells here. And so it's an entirely different conversation, because, you say to the person, okay, here we have a limit of 7 bedrooms. You can get a well and a septic system that can support 7 bedrooms. But these people can be pumping, I just heard about a well that's pumping, 100,000 gallons a minute, or something crazy like that for some of these houses.
For what, watering the grass?
So they're completely sapping the aquifer, and that's another issue that a lot of people are not talking about, is the amount of water use that these homes require, these giant homes.
Yeah.
This is a question for both of you. How did the birth of your daughter, Emma, influence the film? Did it slow things down for a while? Was there a new motivation? I mean, how did that figure into the production?
Well, I can remember, one day in particular coming home from work around, I don't know, maybe it was 6 or 7, and my wife Mollie saying, "You need to be home for dinner." And it was this tension between us where I've been kind of a workaholic for years. I love what I do, and I'm passionate about it, and I just kind of keep going. But she said, "You have to be home for dinner," and so there became a real tension where I agreed that I had to be home for dinner, that I wanted to be home for dinner, and it was like, well, wait a minute, I have a day job, I run a film festival, I can't just dip out of that. So I literally put the camera down. I said, I can't keep traipsing on these job sites. This thing has to take a back seat. But what I'll do is, when I'm with my daughter, I'll film it. And I'll film the building of my own house when I'm working on it. So I did keep filming, but more my own life. And that actually came in useful in the editing of the film because I had all this footage of my daughter being tiny and walking around and learning to crawl. But the film definitely took a back seat for the 3 to 4 years when Emma was first born.
Well, it's very charming, I must say.
Thank you.
How old is she now?
She's going to be 9 in August.
Oh.
Thomas, one of the things that is really striking about the film is how you used visual effects of maps and historical data and aerial photography, which punched way above its weight as far as professional quality. How did you pull that off?
Yeah, I really, someone just told me they watched Quentin Tarantino's 20 Steps to Being a Filmmaker, and in the first 2 minutes he says, hire a great cinematographer, a great, sound guy, and great actors, and you'll have a good film. And so for me, I hired a really great graphics guy, and I hired really good camera people, and that's kind of how I rolled. I didn't spare expense on that. I felt like if I'm going to spend 12 years making a film, I better not kind of half-ass it, excuse my French.
Is it a drone from above?
Well, that's an interesting story. A buddy of mine is a seasoned cinematographer, and he said, I'll get you a deal on a helicopter. I wanted to go get footage of that shifter compound when they were moving it. And he said, it's $6,000 for 15 minutes. So I made some calls, and I raised the money. Thank you, supporters. And, we got the footage. But when I went up in the air, I said, oh, my God, this is incredible. We need more footage. But I couldn't afford to keep on trying to raise that money. And this young intern who was 17 when he started working for me for the film festival, he was 19 then, he said, Thomas, I just bought a drone, and if you pay me $75 an hour, I'll go anywhere on the island and get you the footage you need. And so what was $6,000 for 15 minutes became $75 an hour, and the drone actually goes lower and gets better footage than the helicopter did.
It's really great photography.
Yeah.
So helicopters are becoming like the milkmen of yore,
Yeah.
They're being priced out of the market for this kind of stuff.
Overnight.
Yeah.
And the thing is, when he brought the drone footage into the office, I mean, most of the people that work for me are in their 20s and some of them in their teens. I'm the old guy around here at 49. But he brought this footage in and put it on a desk, and everyone just gravitated. It was just, people were kind of drop-jawed because we hadn't seen that perspective of the place we live.
During the film, the town of Chilmark wrestles with this idea of putting a limit of size of new construction. What did they decide in the end? We've talked about that there was a 2/3 vote, but what did they approve?
It's a very reasonable measure. We couldn't get into all the details. Well, I chose not to get into all the details in the film. Every time I put it in, it was just, it was boring, quite frankly. But the details are, at 3,500 square feet, you can build as of right up to that point. After that point, your neighbors get to weigh in. You have to go to a public review. They get to see what you're planning on building, and you have to meet these certain criteria. And then if you pass all of those, you can build up to 5,500 square feet, which is a big house, mind you. So that's totally reasonable. The thing we were trying to really stop with this bylaw was the big 15,000, the 10,000, the enormous houses. And the kind of compromise point we reached was that if you had more land, because the big argument was, well, what if you have 40 acres in the middle of the woods? What do you care how big my house is? So we have a sliding scale. So, sadly, to me at least, one of the biggest houses in Chilmark is being built right now because the woman owns 42 acres.
Okay.
And so anyway, that's the bylaw. But the nice thing, the kind of really, really, really powerful thing for me was the town of Truro on the National Seashore in Cape Cod. They played my film 6 times there as a way to galvanize support for their movement to limit house size, and they used our bylaw as a template, and they just passed their limit 2 months ago in April.
Nice.
Congratulations. Yeah. I know that made you happy.
Very happy. Because, again, it's one of these beautiful, pristine places that if you were to plop 15,000 square foot homes along the cliff, you would lose this kind of rugged natural beauty of the national seashore.
For those that opposed these changes, Thomas,
yeah.
Have their predictions about people stopping investing and buying houses come true?
No, I'm so glad you asked that, because I have to get one thing across to your audience today. I've played this film in so many different places, and the opposition comes, and I welcome them. I really like having this debate, and they have 3 points each time. To your first point, well, what if people can't build their $1 million, $10 million house? They're not going to want to buy my land, and so we're going to see our property values go down. The exact opposite's happened. An assessor stood up at one of my screenings in South Shore of Boston, and he said, I have been assessing properties in the vineyard for many years, and I want you to know that since your bylaw passed in 2013, we've seen the values continue to go up at a good clip, and we think it's because people know that Chilmark is going to be preserved. It's not going to go the way of East Hampton and Southampton.
Yeah.
So that was amazing. The second point the opposition uses is that, what about jobs? I mean, carpenters need to make a living, and workers need, they pull your heartstrings. Well, so many of my friends here work in the trades. They have never been busier. And if you go to the boat in the morning, we have our own trade parade, except they come on a boat. So when the big house in my film that was the tipping point, the Zoya house, when that was being built, we actually, at the town meeting, a man stood up and said, who here worked on that house, building it? And nobody raised their hand. So, this whole thing about the romantic idea of the guy in the pickup truck with his toolbox in back going to build these houses, that does exist, but that's not where the bulk of the workforce comes from. We can't employ enough people to build the homes that we have going up here on the island. So the other big nugget to that with jobs was that Jessica, a friend of mine who's an attorney and is in the film, she pulled all the building permits for the last 5 years in Chilmark, and of the roughly 85 permits a year, only 1% is for a house larger than 3,500 square feet. So the 99% of the permits are for renovations, modest-sized houses, albeit very nice houses, but so the work is not going to dry up. And the third point, and I say 3 because they never come at me with 10 points. There's like 3 main points I hear every city I go to. And the third one is, well, it's America. It's a free country. Who are you to tell me what I can do on my property? And that's the easiest one to push back on because it's not a free country. It's called zoning. Zoning is there to put rules on what people do to preserve a sense of place. So, the opposition, I don't think they have a great argument.
Speaking of zoning, you ever been to Houston, by the way?
No. Never.
Yeah, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there is no zoning in Houston. You'll see an 8-story condo complex hard by a 7-Eleven, right next to, a 76 station, right next to, because Texas, we're free to do what we want. Well, good Lord.
Yeah, but I have to say, I can't tell you how powerful it is to keep traveling with this film and seeing this, when the lights go up at the end, to see that deer in the headlight look in the audience. It's like I'm watching people realize that they're not alone, that they can. I'm talking about 17-year-old kids and 75-year-old women. I'm not, everyone in between. Matter of fact, people tend to think of social issue documentary as activist-based, angry films. And when someone stands up and is angry at a screening and says, we need a revolution, I quickly say, I'm not part of that. Like, I don't consider myself an activist. I consider myself an engaged citizen. I think we need to work together and not continue to throw punches at each other.
Well, Mollie and Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. You have made a brilliant film that I hope our listeners will watch and buy. How can they get a hold of it?
Vimeo just put it on their new and noteworthy page, so you can go to my website right now and rent it for $5 or download it for $15.
And what's the site?
OneBigHome.com.
OneBigHome.com. Well, we certainly appreciate your joining with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by the angelic Sarah Salk, the real estate agent with wings of pure magic light who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. You can reach her at 919-601-7339. Okay, take us out, Tom.
All right, visit USModernist.org for more information about today's guests. US Modernist Radio is produced at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. Show your support by visiting us at usmodernist.org. And unless Taylor Swift invites the three of us middle-aged men to party with her girl squad in a 30,000 square foot Hamptons McMansion, the probability of which is remarkably low, George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks with another edition of US Modernist Radio.